Do you enter and pass through different phases?
I think so. At first, if my eyes are closed, I might see flashes of light. Recently, I saw a bouquet of flowers, but they appeared as a tracer of light at the edges of the flowers. After passing through this initial phase, perhaps the phase that holds greatest awareness of the physical act of writing, I may perceive a word or two. Often these first words seem completely unrelated to the content, the question, the mood, or the tone. But if I trust the intuition that I perceive the words as I write them, the words are likely a key that opens into more words. While inside the process, I don't necessarily notice distinctions in subsequent phases. I seem to notice when I'm inside the words, following the thread of the words, and then when I'm not. Any qualitative difference in phase or what might be indicative of phase change is more recognizable afterward than reading and writing outside this process.
What happens to your writing while this is happening?
The writing gets messy and often indecipherable. Words trail off the page. A sentence begins on top of or in front of the previous sentence. Ink pools in places. Lines that trail and jolt might indicate a passage into or out of speech. And I wrote, I guess that these are almost considerations of drawing rather than writing. With regard to the content, I don't feel the flow of the writing as I write. It's not intellectually premeditated. If there's anything determined beforehand, it is the simple intention of listening without preconception, free association. After stepping back from the writing and reading it in its wholeness, I might see two things. First, that there is some congruency to the writing which I would not have been able to achieve in subjects that I had not A, given prior thought to, or B, did not really know about, or think I knew about. And second, I feel as though I'm encountering the written piece for the first time, even when I write it.
Have you ever encountered the voice of another person during this process?
I really struggle with this question. I don't know if I can say that a voice coming from within the process is not my own mind creating that voice. But I want to say yes. I believe yes. That there are people or voices which are not mine. I believe that I've felt the voices of various writers and artists, including Picasso, Federico Lorca, H.D., Yasunari Kawabata, Yates, just to name a few, and some people living. I have felt their presence as a fragrance of longing and love within the engagement of the writing. Maybe this is not unlike reading. There's a communication available happening all of the time. There are seemingly infinite texts, conversations between minds, and fields of awareness that compound exponentially and can be engaged before the document. And maybe as with dreams, it takes time to develop a personal understanding and inner cosmology and awareness and to attempt to identify if and to what degree something or someone falls outside of one's own sphere of personal identity. That makes sense.
Thank you. So Joanna shared a lot, and what you just shared was really extraordinary. If you are comfortable, I could also, if people are interested, I could make it available, or I could email, because it's a really lucid description of just what actually happens during this process. And one of the things you said that I really liked is in the beginning is listening at the edge. Listening at the edge. So, thank you so much. So I want to end with a personal story which hopefully illuminates my relationship to hypnagogic writing. And this is where it gets into some of the stuff for the people who were there last night. I included this story in my book, The Grave on the Wall. My grandfather, a Japanese immigrant from Hiroshima, was incarcerated in the Department of Justice prison in Missoula, Montana, under suspicion of being a spy for Japan. He rarely, if ever, spoke about it, and he never spoke about it with me. I was born a few years before Alzheimer's began overtaking his brain. One reason he never spoke with me about incarceration is that he did not remember. And yet he also did not remember because he wanted to forget. His desire to forget manifested in stories that were chronically positive, then in silence. But I felt that what he did not say, which was both enclosed in and hovering around the silence, went somewhere, and I was determined to find out where that was and go there. I moved to Missoula in August 2004 to begin my first semester in the MFA in Creative Writing program at the University of Montana. The commitment to be or becoming a poet was less about enrolling in a program and more about being closer to my grandfather. Living in the valley where he had been incarcerated felt like the first act on the path to becoming a poet. It initiated beyond the confines of academia a relationship with poetry that radiated from an acutely terrestrial disquiet. I felt my grandfather's presence, especially at night. Some nights I heard his voice, distant, with the amplitude of an ember spinning out upon the ground. I wanted to bring his presence and his voice up to where I was, or I should say I wanted to bring myself down to where he was, or felt him to be, buried beneath the accumulation of narratives and counter-narratives by which the truth of his experience had been obscured. By buried, I mean also arrested, that some part of him had not managed or been permitted to be released. By buried, I mean also disintegrating, yet with the fertile energy of that same spinning ember caught in the wave of a subterranean spring. I felt that in order to reach my grandfather, I would have to return to the space of his arrest. I would have to descend and slip into the subterranean spring. My desire as a fledgling poet was to create a space in which the voices of Japanese Americans, voices which had been criminalized and silenced, might be disinterred and permitted a new life. But I felt it was important to make a distinction between these voices and the people themselves, many of whom were then and are still alive, not as a means of separating them from their agency, but of acknowledging that some part of the energy they possessed was arrested and sent into a parallel space where it did not die, but evolved, proliferating a new parallel life. I envisioned the soil and the rocks of the incarceration sites as being composed of this parallel life and of these voices. The question then was how to reach them, not to paraphrase them, not to attempt an approximation of what they might say according to the logic of the language by which they had been oppressed, but to listen. I believed that poetry could at least extend to them a kind of warmth. And yet I also wanted, like my students many years later in Tucson, to communicate directly with my grandfather. So this is from pages 148 to 149 of my book, The Grave on the Wall. I slept for 1 year with a photograph of my grandfather. Under my pillow, sometimes under my body. I wanted to sink with him through the bed, through the floor, into the ground, to commingle with what of him had been arrested. The photograph was taken in 1943 in the prison at Fort Missoula. The first time I saw the photograph, it was hanging on the wall of the museum where the prison once stood. In the photograph, my grandfather is wearing a bra and a slip and is smiling. This is what happened at night. My grandfather slipped out of bed. I woke to see him mounting the wall. I watched him rise up the wall and curve onto the ceiling. I watched him slide down the wall and curve onto the floor. The moment my grandfather touched the floor, two voices emerged, the voice of a young woman and the voice of an old man. The voices emerged behind my right ear, as if out of my shoulder. The voices were clear and materialized a room beneath my room. I wondered if the young woman and the old man were related. I had the feeling they were the same person in two different phases of being. The young woman at the furthest limit of herself as an immigrant before becoming a citizen. The old man at the furthest limit of himself as a citizen before becoming a corpse. I tried every night for 1 year to write down what they were saying. But whenever I shifted or fell further to sleep, their voices became softer, blurred together, then dissolved. The transcription of these voices and the impossibility of transcribing these voices became my first attempt at writing poetry. 16 years later, I am still ushering myself and being ushered into that space. Because I realize that it is not something that happens only once for 1 week or for the span of a single project, but for the entirety of a life. The end.